So the topic that we're doing, this course is, I call it More Than a Defense, and um, it's about the rational defense of the Christian faith. And I call it more than a defense because as we'll see as we go along, I don't think that we should stop at defending our faith. So this is bigger than just defending our faith. It's a rational Christian perspective on thinking, dialoguing, and walking in Christian truth. And this particular lesson is what is apologetics. And so some of you may have heard that term, some of you may not have, but we'll go over it today. So I want to start out just giving some questions to be thinking about. We don't have to answer these right now, but just want you to kind of think about them. First of all, can a Christian both believe by faith and have rational reasons for what they believe? The second question is, does reasoning about God prevent faith in God? And third, does anyone get saved through reason? Okay, is this something? And then, why would anyone need to know arguments for faith? Is that something that's essential or inessential? So first I want to talk about what the word faith means, because I think there's a lot of confusion over the term faith. Because the way that it's used in modern day is different from the way that the Bible uses it. And so in modern terms, so the Bible never asks us to have completely unwarranted belief. One second. To make sure I have my notes. So in modern parlance, the word faith means believing without evidence. That's what most people, when they hear the word faith, that's what they're thinking. But that is not what the Bible means about faith. The Bible actually, when it talks about faith, the Bible is actually talking about trust. The word faith is based on the word that means trust and trustworthiness. It's not about abstract beliefs. It's not about believing things without evidence. It's about trust. Now, there is some aspect of not having evidence for trust, but that's about the future. So if you think about trusting people, we trust people because we know what they've done in the past, and we have confidence that their character will continue to hold in the future. So I don't trust arbitrary people on the street that I haven't met. I trust people that I've had a deep communication with, people who I've relied on in the past, who I know their past character. I know other people who have known them, and so I have trust in them. And it's not a blind trust because I have reason for holding that trust. And then we trust people who we believe to have more information than we do. We trust, in this time of pandemic, we have doctors that we need to trust. And so it's not that we might not know the answers, because we can't compare our answers to that of an expert because we don't have the expertise to know. But we trust in their expertise. We trust the fact that having the required credential is more insight than we might have. So we trust them. It's not trust without evidence. It's trust with evidence. So basically what we're doing is we're using the evidence that we have to know whom to trust when things are less sure. So so when I say I have faith in someone, I don't know the future. So I don't know for sure that the future is going to look like the past, but I have faith because I've seen the evidence for what's happened in the past, and I use that to trust what's going on in the future. And in the Bible, you see it's very similar. So, for example, it says, Abraham trusted God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now, the thing to remember is that, Abraham was not walking around in the middle of a bunch of atheists. Abraham was not the only person. So it's not that Abraham had a faith in that he was the only one who believed in God. He was the only one who trusted God. He was the person who took his knowledge of God and translated that into a trust of God. And so that's what was counted to him as righteousness, that he trusted God, that God would do what he said he'd do. So in Luke 1, here's what Luke has to say about the whole reason why he wrote the book. He's talking to the person that the book's written to, whose name is Theophilus, and he says, which may or may not be their actual name, but may just be a title that basically means lover of God. So it says, with this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Okay, so he's writing to strengthen the faith of Theophilus. Okay, and so his purpose here is, so he carefully investigated everything. So that was the basis of what Luke did. He didn't say, I just trusted everyone who said anything without having any evidence. What he said is that he went through and he carefully investigated everything. And he wrote down what he found out from his investigation so that Theophilus will have a confidence in the thought. He basically says, you may have been taught these things, you weren't sure what to believe. Well, I investigated these things to help you out so that you can be confident in these, so that your faith can be strengthened. So when Jesus is talking about faith, he says, if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown in the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So what Jesus is asking us to do is to look at the evidence of how God treats his creation and use that evidence to trust him for what he's doing in your life. Okay, so again, this is not faith without evidence. This is faith because of evidence. So if you look at all of the healing activities of Jesus, note, people went to Jesus for healing because they knew that that's what he did. They had faith in his continued character and that the things that he did in the past, he'd continue to be able to do in the future. But this is not a blind faith. They weren't going around and asking everybody for healing. They were coming specifically to Jesus because he had a reputation for having done so. And the thing to remember, in the New Testament letters, it talks a lot about faith, but faith is not being contrasted with doubt. Faith is actually being contrasted with works. And so what it's talking about in the New Testament letters is it's talking about having are you operating out of a trust in God, or are you operating out of a trust in yourself? Because when you're operating off of works, that's trust in your own actions to bring you righteousness, as opposed to trusting God to bring you righteousness. Okay, so we're trusting in the faithfulness of God's actions throughout history, and as we can see, the biblical writers did not expect us to hold this without evidence. In fact, it was their goal to bring us evidence. That's the whole purpose Luke wrote. Was to bring the results of his careful investigation to the rest of us. So that brings us to apologetics. So some of you may have heard this term before. Some of you might not have. Apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to answer. Okay, and so the goal of apologetics is answering skeptical questions. And these are questions not necessarily from unbelievers. Sometimes they're from ourselves. Sometimes there's other believers, and sometimes non-believers. Okay, so we have these. So it's answering the questions that we have about our faith and about the Bible. And this comes from the verse in the Bible, 1 Peter 3:15. It says, "Be ready always to give an answer to every man who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you." And so when it says give an answer, that's apologia, and that's where we get the word apologetics. It's not. Some people think that it's based on apologizing. It's not. It's about answering. And so now, personally, I actually think this is a bad use of this verse, because I think what he's actually saying in 1 Peter 3:15 is that if you walk around in hopefulness, people are going to ask you, why are you so hopeful? And so the answer is because we're with Jesus. I don't really think this is a verse about apologetics. I think it's a verse about sharing our faith when people recognize that that we have a hope that's different from other people. But nonetheless, that's where a lot of people in apologetics point to this verse, and that verse, that's where the terminology comes from. So apologetics brings a variety of evidences to bear on the core principles of faith, and we're looking at things such as the existence of God, the historicity of the Bible, and the rationality of Christian doctrine. And most people aren't aware that there's a modern revival in apologetics, because we've got Christians entering different academic fields, and a lot of academic disciplines are being shaped as Christianity is proved true through these various disciplines. So a lot of people aren't aware that 50 years ago, philosophy was almost entirely an atheistic subject. You would hardly ever find a Christian in philosophy. But now, somewhere on the order of 30% of philosophers are now Christians. And so this has happened in a number of fields. In physics, you actually have the growth of the fine-tuning idea, which is the idea that the universe is specially tuned to allow for life in the universe. And so a lot of these different disciplines, even ones that may not be recognized as having anything to do with Christianity, are starting to have influences from Christianity, and it's starting to be felt. So, so what does apologetics do? Okay. So first of all, I want to be careful to say that apologetics is not a replacement for an intimate life of faith. This does not replace your time with God. It does not replace your worship. Apologetics is something in addition to that. And that's true of apologetics, theology, and philosophy. There's a quote by C.S. Lewis. I don't remember it exactly, but basically he talks about if you imagine being on a beach, right? And you go for a walk on a beach. Well, someone might make a map of the beach, right? Well, the map of the beach doesn't replace going for a walk on the beach. It might help you find better places to go for a walk, but it doesn't actually replace the actual process of going for a walk on the beach. We can't say, okay, now that we have a map to the beach, we don't need to go for nice walks on the beach and sit on the sand or anything like that because we have a map. And that's the way we should think of apologetics, theology, and philosophy, as being kind of a map to our Christian faith. It doesn't replace what we do, but it might help us to go deeper or to correct some things. Think about the beach analogy. You might say, oh, well, it'd be easier if we walked over here, or there's a nicer view over here, things like that. So these things are there to provide us a deeper understanding of what we're doing and show how it can apply in larger areas of our faith. It also helps us to stand firmly and confidently in our beliefs. So, if you're a young Christian and you start, everyone develops doubts throughout their lives, and so as if you recognize that your questions, that there are answers for your questions, even if you don't know all, if you recognize that your questions keep getting answered, then you can recognize that if you have new questions, they'll probably be answered as well. And so it helps you stand firmly and confidently in what you believe. It also helps Christians resist sin. And this is because if we're confident in the basic facts of Christianity, then we can be confident that God's rules for our lives are also correct. And so when we don't know why we shouldn't sin, it helps us to recognize that even though we might not know the answer to why we shouldn't sin, we can trust God that He knows what He's doing and He knows what He's asking of us. And then it provides a rational foundation for the engagement of Christian ideas in the world. And we'll cover some of this in this course. I actually have another course that I teach that's on the theology of everyday things and how many things that we have come to recognize and rely on in everyday life actually have theological origins that we're not aware of. And so understanding apologetics helps us to have confidence to use our Christian ideas as a rational foundation for engagement with the world. Now, one criticism of apologetics is that people aren't argued into the kingdom. And that's basically true. There's some exceptions. There are some people who are argued into the kingdom. However, one thing that apologetics does do as far as reaching out to others is that it can remove barriers for people who are considering Christianity. So if someone's own intellect is a barrier for Christianity, apologetics can help to remove those barriers so that it no longer seems so far-fetched that Christianity might be true. But as I said, this course is called More Than a Defense, which means we're going to go beyond simply answering. Historically, apologetics has been defensive. It simply shows that Christianity is a reasonable alternative, or maybe the most reasonable alternative. The problem with that is that Christians sometimes get accused of simply wanting to be proven right. They're like, oh, all you want to do is prove yourself right, and that's that's all you're trying to do. So if you stop at just defending, then that can be problematic, because it shows people, it makes Christianity look like it's inert, that it's not doing anything, that all you're there for is to simply prove your own ideas right. But Christianity is actually active; it's engaging, and so if we stop at just defending, then we haven't gone far enough. If Christianity really is the rational proposition that we believe it is, then Christian doctrine can actually be useful as a foundation for everything else that we do. And so that's my goal, is that we would, as we become more confident in our faith, that we would use our knowledge of Christianity in wider and wider areas. Because a lot of people, when they think about Christianity and how it applies to what I do, they just think about, well, am I being a good person in what I'm doing, or am I being nice to others? Am I, but the application of Christianity actually goes way beyond those things, although those are good starts. And so my hope is that apologetics will lead to a revival of every field of knowledge, by incorporating Christian principles that we found to be true. So that's why I call this More Than a Defense. Defense is only the beginning. The goal is transforming the way that we have knowledge. So it's take every thought captive, compared to the knowledge of Christ. So as we go through, we're going to be engaging with questions. And so I wanted you two all to just think about questions in general. The main thing is, I see a lot of people who try to answer questions too quickly. And the fact is, real good, solid questions take time to find answers. And sometimes, we have a lot of good answers that are, that we can refer to and point to at the ready. We'll cover a lot of those. But the thing to remember is that all of these answers actually came from years of study. I teach homeschoolers calculus, and I tell them that you might be thinking, "Ah, man, I could never have come up with this." But what I tell them to remember is that what we cover in a 45-minute lesson took someone their entire life to come up with. Right? That's why each of these things have somebody else's name by each of them, because each of these represents someone's entire life work that we bake into a little 45-minute lesson. And so this is the thing to recognize with questions, is that good, hard questions sometimes take a long time to answer. And if we are too hasty and we're too rushed and we're like, we need an answer now, and we'll just go with whatever it is that we first think of, that's not always the best way to engage with questions. Solid questions, if you want solid answers, sometimes it takes time. Now, as I said, the nice thing is there's been a lot of people who've worked on this for a long time, so we do have a lot of answers. But my main point is, just don't be in yourself. Try to try to be at peace with the fact that there are some questions that we're going to have to hold on to for a long time and think about for a long time before we really find answers, and that's fine. The other thing is, don't assume that the things that you think about as possible answers to a question exhaust all the possibilities. So there's deep questions, and one of the most interesting things about the history of knowledge is some of the more fascinating answers are not things that people thought of initially. And so sometimes the answer is outside the possibilities that we initially think of. And so this is another reason why we shouldn't be too hasty to come up with answers, is because the real answer may still be something that we haven't even considered yet. The other thing is, be aware of others' perspectives. There's a lot of people in the world, and a lot of us have different perspectives, and it takes humility to think about things from other people's perspectives. And this is especially true when engaging other people. When you engage with others' questions, and recognize that they're actually coming from a different place than you are. The questions that you had when you were struggling with doubt are actually going to be different than other people's questions. And so being able to look at things from their perspectives, to answer, to see what questions they're really struggling with. Because sometimes it's not necessarily the thing that they're asking. Sometimes there's things below the surface that are happening. And being able to dig down and say, well, what are you really asking about? Where is your problem really? And being patient, being humble, and recognizing that other people are coming from different places than you are. This is really important in trying to understand other people and help them understand what the truth is. The other thing, not every doubt or disagreement comes from logic. Apologetics is based on answering people from logic and evidence, but a lot of doubts and disagreements actually come from emotions, experiences, wishes, and even sin. And so apologetics doesn't speak to those reasons for doubting. So the oh, there we go. Yeah. So apologetics doesn't speak to every reason for doubting. There's a whole load of people who in college, they'll see pretty girl, sleep with pretty girl, and then they'll have they'll have a period feel guilty because they recognize that's the wrong thing to do, and then they'll think about, well, I enjoyed sleeping with pretty girl, and Christianity says I shouldn't, but my professor says that Christianity isn't true. And wait a minute, the easiest thing to do is I can just pretend the moral problem away. I can just say that, if I doubt in Christianity, and therefore I don't have any need of these extra rules that prohibit me from doing the fun things I want to do. And so, if you have those type of issues, that is not really something that apologetics speaks to. Apologetics focuses more on the arguments from evidence and reason. And sometimes these intertwine because you recognize, you can help someone recognize where the source of their own doubt is. They can recognize that it's not from reasons and evidence. They can think about that, maybe this is because I really just wanted to do what I wanted to do. And one way that sometimes this is people can break through this is you can ask them, if Christianity was shown to be true, would you follow Christ? You say, we can skip the evidence part. If I were to prove to you somehow, whatever your method of proof is, whatever you accept as proof, if I were to prove to you that Christianity was true, would you accept Christianity? Would you follow Jesus? And if some people, if they're being really honest, will answer no, I don't want to do that. And so then that's not an evidence problem. You don't, because they've already told you that having evidence won't help. So that's when you can that's one way to recognize early on that it's not really if a conversation really isn't about the evidence, it's about something else. So and just to reiterate, the foundation of apologetics is careful thinking. So take your time, think about the different options, think about the different issues, and think about think about the way that they interact with each other. So here's the outline of our course. This is our first talk. What is apologetics? Our next talk is going to be about whether or not we can trust the Gospels. Then we'll talk about whether or not it's rational to believe in God. We'll talk a little bit about God and creation. We'll talk about the idols of reason. And this is a kind of how we can recognize when something is taking the place of God in our reasoning, because that's usually the reason for different people's worldviews, is because they're putting something other than God in the central location. We'll talk about God and the moral order, and about how morality points to God. But then we'll also talk about the problem of evil and suffering. This is one of the main reasons why people point to about why they don't want to believe in God. They'll say, well, if God exists, he's an evil God, or if God exists, why is there suffering? These sorts of questions. And so we'll cover those. And then we'll talk about Christianity and society, how Christian principles affect the way that we interact with society. And then I also wanted to get into Christianity and public policy. I'm going to talk about how we can actually utilize Christianity and how, as a tool for helping us shape public policy from a governmental perspective. And the goal is not to do it in a partisan way, but just simply say, what are the Christian principles that apply here, and how can they be applied to various situations? Kind of give us a tool, kind of an example of using Christian ideas as a tool, and hopefully what you'll get out of that is not just how to use Christianity in this particular way, but also whatever field of endeavor you're in, how might you think about Christianity in a way that helps you apply those ideas to whatever your field of work is. And then finally, we'll go into reaching out with apologetics. How can we engage others? How can we use what we've learned to talk to other people? So that's the course that we're going to be going through. Does anyone have any questions?